Good day, everyone. My name is Brian Prophet with the Open Source Program Office at Red Hat, welcoming you to another edition of Community Central. We are so pleased to be starting off Season 7 of Community Central with two fantastic guests that are going to be talking about community surveys. But before I introduce them, I wanted to go over the usual housekeeping notes. Again, remember, you are always free to ask questions and answers in the tool within the BlueJeans platform. Just go ahead and click on Q&A, get your question in, and feel free to vote on those questions so we can ask them later to our presenters after their presentation. So housekeeping out of the way, without further ado, I'm very pleased to welcome from Red Hat, my colleague Josh Berkus, and from Google, Sophia Vargas. Sophia, welcome to Community Central, and take it away.
Hi, and it's great to be here. Are we showing slide decks? I don't see them.
Yeah. No. Let me go ahead and start the slides.
I made an introduction slide, so you can see me as well as my cats while I explain who I am. Thanks for being and presenting, Josh.
Okay. Yeah, we up on slides?
Great. Next slide, please.
Okay.
So thanks. I'm really excited to be here today. Again, my name is Sophia Vargas, and I'm currently a program manager within Google's Open Source Programs Office. But I'm here today really talking about my former role. I started my career as a market research analyst at Forrester, writing and designing studies since 2011. So I have written a number of studies, worked with the data, written about the data, and now that I sit within Google's OSPO, I help to run a lot of our internal and external studies, as well as working with community managers on surveying their communities. And you, Josh? Next slide.
I'm Josh Berkus. Those of you who are repeat viewers will have seen me here before. I work for Red Hat's Open Source Program Office. In that role, and even before I had that role, I put out a lot of surveys of open source communities, and in the process have learned a lot about what works and what doesn't. Reflecting my lesser survey experience, I have one fewer cat than Sophia does. And so with that, let's get started talking about surveys. I'm going to introduce this a little bit about talking about goals. One of the big things to start with when you are thinking of doing a survey of your communities to start with, why? Why is it that you want to send your community or some part of your community or some group or some team a survey? What is it that you are hoping to accomplish? And so before you do anything else on the survey, what you want to do is you want to actually write out what the goal of the survey is, because that will determine what makes sense to put in the survey. Now, when people take their first stab at this, they tend to write a goal, but they tend to write a goal that is not quite complete. I mean, for example, collect information on contributor demographics annually, because I'm thinking about that because I just yesterday was working on revising the annual Kubernetes contributor survey. And one of the things is, hey, well, why? What information are we trying to collect and why? What will it tell us? One of the ones that we did last year, decide release support policy. Decide, how often Kubernetes is going to be released, how often those releases are going to be supported, etc. But while that's a nice target goal, you have to have some idea of what information you need from recipients to support that. So workshop your goal a little bit and try to make it a more complete goal. That is to say, hey, if you want to collect demographic information, what kind of demographic information and what will that tell you? If you're going to make a decision, what information do I need from surveyees to help me make that decision? And when you've developed a goal for your survey overall, then you're going to start working on things like questions. And one of the things to keep in mind when we're working on questions is each question needs to have a goal too, or maybe more than one goal, right? And if you can't come up with a goal for a question, then you probably don't want to include that question at all. One of your questions is, what will the answer to this particular question tell you, right? Based on how people respond to that question, what kind of decision are you going to make? How is it going to inform you? How is it going to combine with other questions to tell you something useful? If you cannot come up with an answer to this, if you can't come up with what will this question tell me, then the answer is to cut that question. Shorter surveys are better anyway. And often when you determine this goal for a question, you discover you have to reword the question because the question as you've worded it does not fulfill that goal. In example, a question that we had with a very specific goal on last year's annual Kubernetes contributor survey was, we were trying to determine, number one, how to reach people, and number two, which of our various community channels we could potentially cut from moderation because they weren't really being used. And we had the numbers from those channels themselves, but those numbers can often be deceptive, particularly because they didn't tell us about contributor versus user. So of our various communication channels, please rate which ones you use and check most frequently on a 1 to 5 scale. So the goal of this was to actually get an idea of our communications channel activity among contributors. And, from this, we were able to produce some nice graphs and that sort of thing. And we could see that if we were trying to reach people, Slack and GitHub issues were like the #1 places to reach people quickly and for people to see things. Mailing lists sort of, Zoom conferences sort of secondary, and the YouTube recordings and the web forum were terrible ways to reach contributors. We already kind of suspected this information, but we wanted to confirm it. Like, we had the idea that the web forum was used almost entirely by end users and very little by contributors, and this kind of confirmed it. And this also allowed us to combine it with other information about what people's contributor status was and what forums they used to see if there were differences between where people were talking based on what kind of contributor they were. Turned out to be just more of an overall difference, where people who were high-level contributors just checked all the channels more frequently than everyone else. Now, one of the other things that people get into with surveys that is a mistake is what we call completeness, where they add questions just because it seems like they ought to add this question, right? So if you ask a question about which conference sessions did you like, there's a tendency to also put in a question of which conference sessions did you not like. And the thing is, that's not a goal, completeness, right? Because if you have that question of which conference sessions do you like, and you successfully get a large number of attendees to fill that out, you already know which ones they didn't like based on which ones don't get selected by anybody in the first question. And therefore, having the second question is just wasting everyone's time. Don't put it there for completeness' sake. Now that you have your goals, it's time to actually start working on the survey design. And that is over to you, Sophia.
Thanks, Josh. And the first thing I wanted to talk about is also goals. So when you're designing a survey, you're designing with slightly different goals. I really like what you covered earlier in terms of thinking through what you're trying to learn and how you're going to use that information. When it comes to designing the survey itself, your goal is really to minimize what we like to call survey fatigue, which is when you're taking a longer survey and get to a super long question and your eyes start to glaze over, and then suddenly you're reading an article, you forget you're taking a survey. Or maybe you just start clicking with reckless abandon because you just want it to end and you just want to get your free t-shirt. Both of those behaviors are clearly not ideal when it comes to getting people to not only complete your survey, but give you quality data that you can use and support whatever analysis you're investigating. Next slide, please. So when designing a survey, I like to think fairly structurally about how I put something together. First, starting with what did respondents see when they first get to the survey? This could be maybe a blurb or a statement that you put in the survey instrument itself, or maybe at a community forum. Then there's a survey instrument, which is the actual set of questions that you'll use to collect information from your respondent group. And then what are the thing that they end with in the final takeaway and closeout. Next slide. So for that first landing page, I like to be upfront about what you're trying to learn and your general research focus so that you ensure that the right people are interested in taking the study because they know it's going to be relevant to them or the communities that they work in. I like to be upfront about survey length. If you say your survey is going to take 5 minutes and it takes 25 minutes, that increases the chances that you will have a higher abandon rate because people get distracted and aren't committed to taking the full study. A general rule of thumb is don't exceed 25 minutes. If you've ever taken a 25-minute survey, that's a very long survey. So generally, you want to keep it shorter than that. I like to make things about 10 to 15 minutes, but it's important to take it a few times, allow other people to take it so you have a general range of timing so you can be fairly upfront and accurate with how you project this. And the last thing that I like to include is just generally how this information is being used. You know, say who you are, how you plan to use this and share this information. And if you're collecting sensitive information, what are you doing to ensure that there's anonymity or protection around this private information that people might be sharing with you? Next slide. An example could be help us to learn about the Golang community in this 10-minute survey. Say that you'll anonymize the results and share them back to the community via whatever mechanisms are available to you. Next slide. The big caveat here is don't share too much. There's kind of a fine line of what you can say to encourage people to take the study. But if you say you explicitly want to know about the governance structure in a project, or people are now thinking what their opinions are already about what that governance structure looks like, or maybe they know exactly who you're trying to talk to, they're going to walk into your survey with a preordained notion of how they want to answer your questions. Keep it general. Allow them to know the topic area, but not too specific that you're starting to influence how they respond to your study. Next slide. So screeners, as you've written all of these questions, you know what you're trying to learn from this group. You should know which group you need to take the study. And so screeners is where you filter out anyone who's clicking through your study to ensure the right people are then getting passed on to the questions that you've put in place for this study. Now, again, thinking about that last point, don't share too much about what you're looking for. If you're telling people exactly that I'm only looking at users and contributors to a specific project, then say if you have an incentive involved about, I guess, a free t-shirt is the example I like to come back to. I know now as a random person that I just need to say that I'm a contributor or user of this project in order to get through the study. So you don't want to say too much about who you're looking for because then it allows individuals to game the system. But at the same time, you want to ensure that you are getting the right people filtered into your study. So figure out who you need and then make sure you have a couple of questions that ensure they tick all the boxes that you're looking for. And then it's generally good practice to screen out all minors. If you ever collected data around people that are under 18, there's additional bevy of regulation, policy, and legal considerations. So generally, it's easier to just avoid unless you have a very good reason to. Next slide. So this is the core component of your study. What are you trying to learn? And this is where all those kinds of questions will go. Again, thinking about the overall survey design goal of ensuring that people don't get tired and mental fatigue while they're taking your study, you want to limit the number of questions that they see. Say now you have two fairly divergent populations within your respondent group, and you want to ask them different kinds of questions. Now, one way to do this is to say allow for either a non-required question response or have an NA, does not apply to me or not applicable option in the question itself. But that doesn't reduce the number of questions that the individuals have to read. So you have to take that into account in terms of the whole overall survey time. Now, one way to get around this is if you're using a slightly more sophisticated survey instrument, you can have branching logic in your survey. So that means say you ask how you engage with the project, and the folks that select users now only see the questions directed about users, and those that are contributors only see the questions directed to contributors. And that way, one individual respondent does not see all questions. So you can limit the number of questions that they see overall. Now, there's always the question of, okay, what if you're both? Then, depending on, again, the sophistication of the tool, you can often set quota. Say, like, 50% go either or, and it randomizes that. And as you, as the moderator of this, can follow that progression and change that logic as the quotas are starting to fill, or you say you're getting a ton of users but no contributors, you can keep track of that in real time and adjust that logic. Next slide. So another thing to think about in terms of your overall questions is the flow of the question, ordering and grouping. So I generally like to group together common themes of questions. Just thinking again about someone's mental focus. If I'm asking you a series of questions about documentation, but they're sprinkled throughout other topics, let's say preference of channels, I like that example from Josh earlier, or again, thinking about leadership, sentiment, governance, and all these other topics around a project, bouncing around between all those different themes is pretty exhausting, and it can kind of, you have to kind of reset, okay, how do I feel about this? So generally, in terms of keeping people's attention and focus, it's a good idea to group together common themes of questions. Now, that being said, you also want to think about the order in which the questions are asked. We lost a slide. There we go. So thinking about the order in which questions are asked. So the example that I have here is, say you're asking a question about documentation, and you are curious to know, and given the set of documentation, what do you think should be the core set of assets that we include across all of our repositories, say in our standard template? And you've presented a list of asset types. Now, later on in the survey, if you have a question that's open-ended, what documentations you think we should add to our project? Now, the person taking the survey already has a list in their head that they've seen earlier, and that is going to change the way that they answer your question. So if you did want to ask a question like that, you typically would put it before they see this question that gives them a couple of ideas that could influence the way they answer your open-ended question. So here, question order does matter if the way that you ask a question can influence the way that they would answer another question. Next slide. Last part of that's core to a survey instrument is your demographics. So this is the section where you ask all the questions about the person themselves to better understand who they are, where they work, how they identify, and all these other kinds of questions that would fill into creating a role and profile within your respondent base. Now, when I first started writing studies, I used to put the demographics section in the screeners because, again, thinking about topic grouping, there's going to be a lot of similar questions that you might ask in a screener section as you would ask in a demographics section. However, lately I've started to put the demographics section at the end for one primary reason. Again, thinking about minimizing survey fatigue, these kinds of questions should be the easiest to answer. If you're writing a particularly long survey, you don't want to put thick, thought-provoking questions at the end when you're sort of at the end of someone's attention span. That's just harder to get through. Whereas I should know where I live and what best describes my role. So that's a lot easier for me to answer without a lot of deep thought. This is also a place where you can start to ask more sensitive questions about how someone might identify in, say, race, gender, or disability. And I think it's really important to ask these kinds of questions, especially if you, say, are trying to understand who the underrepresented groups are in your community population. But I also think that it's important to have an explicit opt-in, opt-out for this, because it can be uncomfortable to answer, especially if you say it's a very small respondent base or community and only one person identifies this way. It might be easy to single them out, even if you anonymize the responses. So I think it's important to allow folks to opt in or opt out. And even though I suggested up front that you said how you plan to use, store, retain, and share this information, it might be a good idea to just refer to that again in a quick bullet so they feel more comfortable opting in if that's something they're considering. Next slide. One last thing to note here is these questions can be potentially the hardest to write because they have to be comprehensive in nature. Whatever you don't an example I gave recently is I was running a survey at a recent event in a booth and realized halfway through from the others that I didn't put student in my respondent role type. And so I quickly had to add that in, and then you have some funkiness of your data model not exactly lining up in the back end. But you want these to be as comprehensive as possible. As I've written and designed surveys for a number of years, I kind of have a canned list of things that I ask over and over and have been improving that over time, but that can be cumbersome to build on your own. So I would suggest looking around at other people's studies, something like the Open Demographics Project by Nikki Stevens, things where you can see a comprehensive list and then choose how you want to aggregate and condense in your own, but you don't want to leave things out of this one. Next slide. And then I like to end with just sort of a general thank you, close out, and some sort of expectation setting around where and how to find the results. If you are going to be emailing them, maybe this is where you say, if you'd like to receive the results, please put in your email here, state how you will use that information, i.e. contact you for the results and data coming out of the study. Next slide. A couple considerations of just question formats as it relates to flow. Most studies are built primarily with multiple choice questions. These are easiest to answer in sort of that thinking about your time window of how much time you want to spend per question. So open-ended questions can be a way to gather rich context. They're better for something like a sentiment question or something that you weren't able to really contextualize in a multiple choice. However, I would say try to limit these as much as possible. So the question I like to ask myself is, what am I trying to learn? Am I trying to test a hypothesis, or am I just looking for more open feedback? Think about it also from the analyst's perspective. If you're looking at data from, say, 20 respondents, reading through 20 to 25 open-ended responses, okay, that might take you an hour or so. Now, if you have a respondent group of over 200, suddenly that becomes a lot more untenable. So think about limiting what you want to gather in that forum as it relates to what you're trying to learn, as well as what you're going to do with that resulting data. In terms of multiple choice questions themselves, generally it's a good practice to not put a huge list of options. Again, just thinking about how long it takes to read through them all and the poor respondent who's trying to retain that all in their recent memory in order to make the most appropriate selection. For a general rule of thumb, I was told keep it to about 13. Clearly not all questions will fit into this format. I think one for me that always stands out is, what is your primary programming language? And there I have maybe 25 responses because there's so much variety in some communities. So you might not be able to do this, but it's good to keep it in mind. If you can condense it and make the list shorter, that just enables folks to actually read through all the options before they make a selection. On that front as well, if the survey tool allows it, randomize the responses in the multiple choice row. It seems like a simple thing to do, but again, thinking about the mentality of the person taking the study, if they get to the second row and they agree with it well enough, they're more likely to click to that and move on versus reading through all the options. So by randomizing the results, that kind of helps to minimize that effect. And then personally, I like to declare the question type. So if you don't list anything, it's assumed that it's a select one. So if it's a select all that apply or rank your top 3, then the person taking the study also knows that before they look at the results, versus having to get through and then get some sort of error when the survey tool says you haven't answered this appropriately. Next slide. And the last thing I wanted to mention, which is much more applicable if you're doing any sort of incentivized survey that would potentially encourage bad actors to get through just because they, again, want that free t-shirt. So some of the quality checks that I've implemented in the past include things like knowledge tests. So say something what technologies are you familiar with? And then you throw in something like space computing, which I would love for that to be a thing, and I have heard about people building out computing infrastructure on space that might be turned into some distributed laser-based connected network of infrastructure. That being said, right now that's not a thing, so that could be an obvious indicator that someone's not necessarily familiar with what you're talking about. I also like to look for conflicting responses. So say in the demographics portion, you ask, how big is your engineering team? And then later on, you ask, how big is your company? And if their engineering team is larger than their company, then potentially that's an indication that they did not actually closely read or answer these things correctly. Lately, I have also been seeing more bots and automated responses trying to get through a survey, especially in paid samples. In this case, you can look for, again, knowledge tests or conflicting answers, and also look at the open-ended answers. We had a couple of respondents put in, how now brown cow, for a sentiment question, and clearly that was not a real response. And so that was a red flag for us to look into the rest of that data around those samples. Other things to look for include straight lining. So in matrix questions, this could be, you have a bunch of rows and then you have please rate your experience or strongly disagree to agree on a scale of 5, and you have a bunch of rows to click through. Straight lining means you selected C for all possible options in that question. And maybe you really did feel neutral about all of these various things, but if a person does that in multiple different matrix questions, then potentially that could also be a red flag as to their their attention or the attention they're paying to the survey as they're taking it. If you do have a lot of matrix questions, which I generally advise against because they can be very cumbersome to get through, but you have to do it, I would encourage putting in a check question. So this is select C for this row, and that's something you typically can say, don't randomize that row, again, if the tool is sophisticated enough to do that. And then that could be a much larger red flag because then someone is clearly not reading through the options as they're clicking wildly through your study. The last thing I look for is time distribution to take the survey. So again, you have a number and a range of numbers that you think minutes it should take to take the study. And if you see people are taking, say, half the time or a quarter of the time, then clearly they weren't reading through the questions as much. So I would recommend, say, figuring out your time distribution, and then that can be something that you also rate as a potential flag for inappropriate behavior or just not quality data. Now, all of these things you can probably rationalize around individually. So their general recommendation is to assign fault values to each of these kinds of tests and say something like a check question would be higher than a straight lining potentially within your respondent base. And then you screen out based on individuals' failure scores. And this is just a way that you can kind of engineer quality into the survey design itself to help you achieve quality data. That's the end of my section, so I'm going to pass it back over to you, John.
Yeah, and with that quality engineering in mind, I'm going to go a little bit more in notes about how to write good questions. Because in order to get good data, your questions have to be sort of well composed. My basic sort of set of principles around writing good questions is that questions need to be what we call atomic, specific, and complete. And I'll explain that. So the atomic portion comes not from not from atomic energy, but from Democritus's concept of atomic being an indivisible unit. And from that perspective, you want questions to ask one and only one thing. In other words, one thought, one question. Let me give you a sort of counter example of that, what happens when you write non-atomic questions. A good example of a non-atomic question is, what things do you like or dislike most about the event, as a free response question? And then somebody responds, the social hour. Well, now you don't know whether they like the social hour or whether they dislike the social hour because you asked them a non-atomic question. And so that often leads to garbage instead of data. A much better example of that, if you actually wanted to know both likes and dislikes, would be you need two different questions so they can be atomic. What did you most like and what did you dislike? However, often non-atomic questions are more subtle than this, are a little bit less obvious, so you don't realize that you're asking them. One I recently actually had to go through and revise was, it said, which related software to the one we're surveying about do you use? And if you look at this list, it's like, okay, well, we've got a whole list of software here, click all that apply, seems straightforward. Well, but here's a problem. On that list of software, we have two different container building tools, one orchestration tool, two different operating systems, and a programming language. So if somebody decides to use that other option, they have the entire universe of all software in existence in front of them, meaning you're not really going to get useful responses. What we did instead was we broke this up into the different types of software we were interested in asking about. So we had a distinct atomic question about container tools and a separate distinct atomic question about OSs. Now, once the questions are atomic, we also need to be very specific. So the questions need to ask exactly what it is you want to know from the surveyee, and it needs to ask it in terms that the surveyee themselves is going to understand. There's a big tendency to say, oh, survey fatigue, long surveys give people fatigue, therefore my questions should be short, and that doesn't follow. Your questions should be long enough that you're actually communicating what it is you want to know, or use descriptions, or use links to external definitions, etc. because if the surveyee doesn't understand what you're asking, they're going to give you inappropriate responses, and then you can't trust your data. So an example of this, sort of improving, right, is one of the standard things when you're surveying people who use your open source software is like, which versions do you use? Well, that's an okay question. But what might be better, if this is what you want to know, is to say, which versions do you use in production? If you're looking for production users. And what's an even better if you're looking for production users is to actually say, which version are you currently using in production right now? Because the previous version of the question leaves people in doubt and say, okay, well, I used to use version 7 in production. Do I include that, if I was using it last month, or do I not include it, right? And tell people, no, I want a snapshot of which ones you're using in production right now. And that way, the surveyee and you both have the same understanding of what data you want. And then the final thing in terms of getting good, clear answers from surveyees is to make sure that your questions are complete, particularly when you're using multiple choice options. So after you determine who your audience is and you've segmented out your audience into different segments, make sure that every segment of your audience can pick at least one option or have some kind of an other option or comment that allows them to respond if they don't fit any of the other responses. So an example of one within the Kubernetes organization that we workshopped a lot to make sure that it was fully complete was the question of people's advancement on what we call the contributor ladder. And we did a couple of different things to make sure it was complete. First of all, we tried to resolve the ambiguity of if people say, hey, I'm a contributor on this sub-project, but I'm an owner on this other sub-project, what do I answer? And so within the description of the question, we said, pick the highest level if you're involved in multiple sub-projects, right? And then the other thing that we did to the question is we added not one, but we actually added 3 different does not apply options in order to differentiate between the different kinds of does not apply, right? Not interested, not yet started, and I don't know what you're talking about, because those are actually different things. And if, it doesn't make the question too long, it's useful to differentiate between different non-responses. So with that said, we are ready to open for questions, and we've got a bunch of questions in the Q&A. And so I'm going to stop sharing. Turn on my video. And here we go.
All right, well, thank you very much. And we do have questions. So first one is going to be from Kevin. How do you reduce the risk of impact bias in survey responses?
Implicit.
Oh, I'm sorry, implicit. Thank you for reading that for me, Josh.
Sorry, but.
No, it's cool. But how do you do that?
I'll start and then I'll let Josh go, because I think Josh, you raised a couple of excellent points about being overly specific in your questions. I will say candidly, anytime you're filtering or looking at a specific respondent group, it is always going to be a bit biased. So generally, I just like to be super upfront with that. Anytime I'm presenting the data coming out of it, we know that this respondent group is going to have a pre-existing experience with the thing that we're talking about. So they will have their own bias coming into the study. I think in terms of the question type themselves, I like Josh's recommendations about being overly specific and simple in how you ask the question to ensure that there's no ability to misinterpret how you're stating it. Within that, I think, again, like survey design things, if you have the ability to do things like setting quotas, you can try to increase more balance in your respondent group. So say for a large study that I've worked on, over 1,000 respondents, I'll set quotas around geography. I want to ensure that I have a multinational respondent group and say 20% from each of my primary geographies. I'll set quotas around company size, around role type. And this is, again, once you've filtered in enough people that you've hit your quota for, say, US respondents, then you stop collecting respondents from that group. Or else you will have more bias towards specific types of distributions within your sample. Josh, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, one other thing I would say is for implicit bias in question structure, which is obviously a danger for me as, given my status. In projects where I have access to specifically a diversity group, like a code of conduct committee or diversity initiative or whatever, I actually try to run surveys past them because those usually contain a bunch of people who are different from me, and those people will often spot ways that I have structured the question to make assumptions that I wasn't necessarily aware of.
I think that's an excellent recommendation.
Okay. Our next question is from Michael, and Michael is one of our colleagues here at Red Hat, and he is asking about Red Hat specific things around survey tools, but I want to expand that question a little bit because I know we have guests from outside of Red Hat, and combine it with a question from Carolyn in chat, where basically it's like, are there survey sites that you would recommend that are efficient and easier to use, and what would those sites be?
I don't want to explicitly recommend anything because I know I'm not supposed to endorse any product. I think the ones that I'm more familiar with have been SurveyMonkey, Qualtrics, Forms from Google. I think there's always going to be sort of the free versus paid. Something like Qualtrics will give you a lot of, say, functionality around logic and question type and pre-canned structure in your questions, but then you have to have a subscription to it. So I think it's sort of balancing your budget to your functionality. And I tend to go, what is the cheapest one for what you're trying to achieve? I know there are other instruments as well. Those are just the ones that I've used recently.
Yeah, the only ones I regularly have access to are Google Forms and SurveyMonkey. The Google Forms has the advantage of being free. It's honestly a good enough survey tool for a lot of people, particularly if you're just getting started making surveys. And it's nice in that it makes it easier for a committee to collaborate on designing the survey together because of the ability to share editorial with multiple people. SurveyMonkey is a lot more sophisticated of a survey tool in that it has flow controls and a lot more different kinds of questions and the ability to bulk reload responses and randomize responses, which I don't think Google Forms has. But it's less collaborative. Often when I'm designing surveys in a committee, we actually design them using a Markdown doc or a Google Doc first and then put them into SurveyMonkey. It requires a greater degree of sophistication among that. Like, for example, if you get a data dump out of SurveyMonkey, it requires more data skills in order to turn that into a useful bunch of charts because they, for good reasons, they give you more granularity in terms of how they output the question responses, but it also requires you to be able to do more data munging.
Yeah, I think the plus one on that is depending on the sophistication of the tool. I've used providers that have only given me SPSS files, which you do need special tools to look at. They're not just CSVs or Excel spreadsheets. So you should ask that if you're especially working with a third-party provider, what kinds of formats you're going to get the data back in. Because SPSS is great for, say, building your own custom design filters and custom tables. But if you're not used to using SPSS, then that can be a barrier to entry.
Okay, good to know. We are coming up on 6 minutes left, so we have time for a few questions. Kevin asks, how can I determine the right sample size for my survey and research? 10, 50, 100, 1,000, like where do you kind of land on those sorts of things?
This is all Sophia. Honestly, for community surveys, my answer is always, my problem is getting as many people as possible to respond. You know, if I get roughly a third of what I think the community size is responding, I feel like I've done a brilliant job. And it's difficult to get to that number. So
yeah, I think that's usually the constraint. I would agree with Josh on that. For paid samples, if you do have more money to throw at the problem, larger is better because that does give you more potential to, say, segment and compare respondent groups. So I think that the numbers to keep in mind are, say, look up, say, a margin of error table per sample size. And the margin of error is basically between how different people are responding to the study. There's some expected variance in it. So if your percentage differences are so close and your samples are small enough, then you can't extrapolate that these populations are nominally different at all, responding nominally different to any of your questions. So the larger your sample size is, then the smaller the margin of error. So for, say, a sample size around 1,000, the margin of error is 3%, whereas in 100, it's 10%. So that gives you a lot more flexibility if you want to compare samples, and being able to cut up your sample into smaller pieces that will have larger margin of error, but then you have some ability to say, well, users felt this way, contributors felt this way, and we can see that the results are nominally different because my n size is large enough. Also, when you get into larger groups, and if you do want to do any sort of extrapolated back-end industry distribution weighting, you're probably not doing this with these kinds of studies, but there are some that are saying, I want this to represent global developer population distribution, then there might be some modeling on the back end, and you do need larger sample sizes, say over 1,000, in order to start manipulating the proportion of population within your distribution. But I'm guessing that that's probably a little bit too sophisticated for just a community study, because you don't want to do something like that to this particular group of folks.
Okay. All right, excellent. So next question from John, who edits surveys and often encounters authors who, write questions and assume knowledge in their head is actually knowledge in the world. So the use of acronyms and ambiguous terms and synonyms for the same thing. So given that, what advice do you all have for the testing, the understanding and the interpretation of a given question?
I like to refer to Josh's prior answer here to other people first, because you can help to change your assumed bias. I also just like to be as explicit as possible. If you do an acronym, make sure you spell it out at least the first time so that folks are familiar with what you're referring to. And then, say in a question, be really specific about what you want to know. Say if it's what tools are you using, you say at your company, or what tools does your company allow you to use, or what do you use personally? And so by just adding more, I don't say caveats, but adding more specificity, I guess that's also Josh's recommendation around how you answer a question. That should hopefully help to minimize that. But I think there's always going to be sort of this level of perceived jargon that will go into studies, especially around specific kinds of technology. So I think also upfront, in terms of how you filter people into your study, that's where you can kind of gauge their level of awareness with specific kinds of concepts. Because if you do want to test specific ideas around technologies or projects, you are going to want to make sure that folks have a basic level of understanding of these things. So if you want to spend a lot of time around a specific concept, then maybe that's something you add into the upfront screener section to test whether or not people are aware of this. And if they are, then they can see the rest of the survey.
Yeah, and jargon isn't necessarily bad, right? Because if it's jargon that your target audience is expected to understand, and you're not testing whether or not they understand it, then it's perfectly legit and in some ways even screening to put it in questions, right? So, like, for example, if I'm surveying the Kubernetes community, I don't have to define what a container runtime is, right? My whole target audience knows what a container runtime is at least well enough to answer a question. And if they don't know, they're actually not part of my target audience.
Okay, and I'm looking at the clock, and we have just a little under a minute left. So I think we are done with questions now. For those of you who have asked a question, they will be passed on to our presenters, and they will be answered in public forums, either on communitycentral.tv or internally on Red Hat's intranet, the source. So we definitely appreciate everyone's time and attention and great questions for our presenters, and certainly the insights and expertise of our presenters, Sophia Vargas and Josh Berkus. Thank you so much for coming on to Community Central today and talking about surveys.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you again. And with that, that wraps up another edition of Community Central. Stay tuned. We will be launching the rest of Season 7 very shortly. So look for announcements around new programs, around that, what's going on in the open source ecosystem. Until then, be safe and have a great day.